For over 46 months, Russia is waging war on Ukraine. Today, we will examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupka, and this is Build Situation Room. We'll begin again with situation in former 65,000 resident Pokrovsk. There's a new Ukrainian video from there that at first looks like a show of strength, basically a multiple rocket launcher strike on the town, which however suggests that Ukraine has probably now finally lost the vast majority of the town. We watch the video and see it's a Grad launcher, a BM-21, being used here by the Ukrainian army to shell Pokrovsk from a distance relentlessly. And we know these rockets have huge dispersion. We also know the Grad has to be parked way back because of the drone threat, so it's probably about 20 kilometers away from the target, give or take. We can take a closer look at this. First off, you can see the Grad's drone protection here. In other words, they copied it too, after everyone really laughed at the Russians at the start, so they're trying here to protect their own. Weapons at a 20-kilometer range. Now we can clearly see the impacts, which we'll check the map shortly. There are strikes in the north of the city, in the northern factory complexes themselves. So not in the city center and also north of the railway line. And that's actually quite interesting because we still have the claim from the Ukrainian armed forces that they would have split the city and control the areas to the north of the railway line. But that doesn't really seem to be the case. Otherwise, you simply couldn't afford to be firing those crude Soviet weapons with such huge indiscriminate scatter at a place like that. We can also observe that at least 3 or 4 rockets get fired. And then we see 1 or at most 2 impacts here in Pokrovsk. So we know that many of the rockets that were just fired don't actually land within the drone's limited field of view and remain out of sight of the camera, so outside the view. And it really shows how things are over there. They don't expect to run into their own troops here anymore, and so we also don't assume these parts of Pokrovsk are still under their control. We're looking at it on the map, and you can see that the map provider Deep State Map has further revised things in recent weeks, including much of the area to the north. The railway line is now marked in dark red, so it's indeed under Russian control. We can pencil in this railway line for the time being, which, as I mentioned earlier, some Ukrainian battalions claim is currently the boundary between Russian-controlled and Ukrainian-controlled areas. So the rail line actually runs into the town right here and then comes back out of it once again shortly after. And theoretically, at least if you believe the Ukrainian, most of the northern areas of it should be under Ukrainian control. What we just saw, though, were strikes from those Grad rockets up here in the northern part of the city just a moment ago. That means not just north of the rail line, but also north of the N32 motorway, which continues on to Monohrad. And then further on toward Kramatorsk, and you can see that this strike area pretty clearly shows what we're looking at on the map. The whole area is marked dark red. Most of the city is firmly under Russian control, and there continue to be individual raids, single missions by the Ukrainian forces into the city to kill individual Russian soldiers. However, and these videos are getting rarer, it seems the Ukrainians are slowly coming to terms with the fact that they've lost Pokrovsk and are now trying to defend both suburbs, Rodinsky in the north and Hairishin here in the northwest, and at least try to establish that as a new front. We'll stay a little longer in the Donetsk region, but head a bit further northeast to Chasiv Yar. There's a new video from the Ukrainian forces that clearly shows this so-called flag play in action today. Like sneaking into the gray zone between the two fronts every now and then, briefly raising their flag there for a short time, ripping down the enemy's flag and putting up their own to mark the spot. That's happened again. Here in the small town of Maiska, at the start we see Russian footage, which Ukraine is using here though. We see the Russians raising their flag, which is crucial for Ukrainians to note since it signals control on the ground there and affects local morale, operations and even tactical decisions, which is basically being undone. So here's the Russian flag again. Now we see new footage, night shots from the Ukrainian army showing 2 Ukrainian soldiers coming in here after there had only been 2 Russians who went into Maiska. That means they're risking their lives here. You shouldn't forget, just as easily as these guys are picked up on the Ukrainian thermal scope, they're of course also seen by the Russian thermal scope. That means the Russians, when they've got the surveillance drone nearby, can see perfectly well that Ukrainian soldiers are coming up and are now going to hoist their own flag here in Maiska. We're looking at the whole thing now, like I said, in night vision, but here on the left you can again see the same water tower we just saw that the Russians showed earlier during the day. The Russians are a bit less careful with their own troops, so they go in during the day, even though it's even more dangerous than at night. And now we're seeing a Ukrainian soldier, now we see him basically climbing up this tower here. how he puts up their own flag there and rips down the Russian one. And then the next day we saw it again in daylight here. Once more the blue and yellow flag that was proudly raised in Maiske, now clearly visible. And this whole thing shows us that we're in the grey zone. It's not firmly Ukrainian nor firmly Russian, but rather stuck right between the front lines. And in the end, the Ukrainians even show us the 2 Russian soldiers who raised the flag here and who were captured as part of their propaganda missions for the Russian Ministry of Defense on camera for viewers. Let's take a look at it on the map and try to understand why Maiske is so important. A small but crucial spot near Chasiv Yar. And now we can see the situation here on the eastern front. Chasiv Yar is still partly held by Ukrainian forces for the moment. The Russians admitted that recently too, after they'd been claiming it for months. They said they'd have Chasiv Yar completely under control. There are still individual houses here, and pretty solid ones at that. Large apartment blocks that the Ukrainians are holding. And the Russians are currently trying to push forward, once in the south via Steposhki and once in the north via Maiske, as we just saw, to carry out that pincer movement again, trying to encircle Ukrainian positions. To defeat the Ukrainians in the solid buildings, in the very tough structures in Chasiv Yar, not by attacking them directly and driving them out, but by wearing down their positions over time. Cut off their supply lines and force them to fall back. You've seen that repeated time and time again over the past months in so many towns already. Maiske, as you can see here on the map, parts are orange and some aren't marked yet as of right now. So it's basically a frontline town or a frontline village right in the grey zone between Russian-occupied and still Ukrainian-held areas. From Donetsk, we head a bit further west to the Dnipropetrovsk region in central Ukraine. Heavy fighting is still raging there too, and we have a new video from the Ukrainian army showing that a suburb of a fairly important frontline city is now under Russian control, as the footage clearly shows and leaves no doubt, even though that was denied by the Ukrainians in recent days and weeks. Here we see excerpts, footage from Orestopil, a small village just south of an important frontline river in the nearby area. Ukraine, in the last few days, or about 2 weeks ago, claimed it had retaken 5 frontline villages here, saying Orestopil was among them. Either it was already false back then, or the situation here has significantly worsened again for the Ukrainian army. Either way, we can clearly see that numerous kamikaze and bomb drones are being used repeatedly and aggressively to attack Russian units in Orestopil. And so we can be fairly sure that the Russians have numerous soldiers on the ground here, that this place is now firmly under their control. Here we can also see the different footage again, the normal view and the thermal view side by side, which gives us an even better picture of the situation. And it really looks like Orestopil is completely under Russian control, putting the Russians once again extremely close to the next important city and already within striking distance. We're looking at this on the map, and you can see we're now kind of zooming a bit further to the west, just a little more now. And the town I was talking about has that really tricky name, Velikomikhailuka, if you can even pronounce it. And this little town is basically the second most important town after Pokrovsk here in the region. Here you can see the town, and the footage we just saw was from Orestopil. The map provider, Deep State Map, is being very conservative now, or you could say very pro-Ukrainian. We marked the whole area as contested, but also added this really thin strip, which unmistakably leads right to it. I think the reality here actually looks a lot worse than that, but as we can see, there's a noticeable presence of Russian troops in Orestopil and likewise in Oleksivka, and that simply didn't come across like that on the footage, at least right now, as if Ukrainian soldiers right next door were just waiting to retake this position. Velikomikhailuka, the second most important town, I said the most important town in the region, stays over here. Pokrovsk, that's the absolute, the golden apple, so to speak, here in Dnipropetrovsk. In this region, at least, the provincial one, they're trying to hold it. They're still trying to keep the logistics running, to keep the Russians both to the east, toward Dnipropetrovsk, and to the south. Here we can see, faintly dashed, it's down at the bottom, the Zaporizhia region starts here to keep Russians at bay in all directions. So it's important to hold Pokrovsk and of course to keep the Russian army pretty far away. We can maybe see up there in the corner, and that's 4 kilometers. That means Pokrovsk is already well within the direct operational range of Russian fiber optic guided kamikaze drones. But the Ukrainians keep trying to hold them off. We've seen repeated counterattacks here on a number of different villages over the past several days and weeks now. Like I said, it's marked blue here. Sadly, you can't see it. But Sosnivka, an important village at that crossroads, remains under Ukrainian control. Marked in blue, so recaptured. But the footage we saw makes us doubt its holding, and here too, it doesn't look really secure at the present time. As if the Russians were slowly but surely, extremely slowly but surely, advancing toward Pokrovsk, inching forward all the while. The slowly advance and thus continuing slightly further westward inside the Dnipropetrovsk region. It's much worse for the Russian army around Kupiansk in northeastern Ukraine right at the moment. Here we have new footage showing that Russia is pretty desperately trying to refill its troops, which are basically surrounded in Kupiansk. The last one's still there, hanging on amid fierce fighting and dwindling supplies. They're saying about 100 to 200 Russian soldiers, and the routes to them are almost completely cut off. What we're seeing here is the approach of a Ukrainian drone, but the main thing to see here is the Oskil. That's basically the frontline river, which divides these fronts in the Kharkiv region, over which the Russians tried to cross and carry out this extremely difficult maneuver to attack on the west side of the Oskil, with the goal of securing a permanent foothold there and thereby pushing their offensive further forward. Even though they don't yet hold the east side of the Oskil here, and we're about to see a Russian soldier hiding somewhere down here. Right, we'll see the drones approach in a sec, but it's important to note again, where did the soldier come from? From the other side of the river, it's basically the eastern, the backside here. He came across somewhere, maybe in a rubber dinghy or something, and now he's trying to make his way forward here on his own. This is really a suicide maneuver by the Russians, because they simply have no logistics and they're in a much worse position here. And now we can see individual Russian soldiers, not just him but many others, some towards us, trying to make their way to Kupiansk in tiny groups of just 1, 2 or 3, that they're all getting killed on the way, which is why Kupiansk is still holding firm. What remains under Ukrainian control here is what I just said. The drone is now flying straight toward the lone soldier who's trying to fight his way through these private houses nearby. They're all abandoned, of course, and we see that happen over and over. Some robots got the Russians in there, so they're trying, since you can't get tanks and APCs across the river, at least with those small robot units, which the soldiers don't even have anymore, to be loaded onto boats to get across. But all in all, we pretty much only have infantry. And here, which I find really interesting, a large part of the Russian troops seems to have been given these orders over the past few months. If you don't move, drones won't spot you. No idea how Russians thought of it. We still remember in the early months they were always rolling on the ground, flinging themselves around and stuff. Some of them ran off too. Right now it seems the Russian general staff is telling the soldiers, just stand still, don't move, and everything will be fine. We can see that's not working at all. In several cases here, stationary Russian soldiers are basically being attacked by these drones and then getting hit, which in the vast majority of cases then leads to the soldiers' deaths. Overall, it just shows us the winter conditions. Right now it's about minus 19 degrees at the front in Kharkiv, and it shows us that the Russians are, as I said, pretty desperate to get back to Kupiansk, but at the moment they just can't manage it, repeatedly failing to make any real progress. We can see it all on the map here. I think I'll pause it on the first one for now, because what's really important to note is that the Russians are currently trying to push further in here along the eastern bank. So they're trying to make up for that disadvantage they had. You can already see it here, that very thin orange strip leading into Kupiansk. They're trying to level it out by actually building real logistics lines all over the Oskil. That's not the case yet. We'll let it run and I'll show where these recordings were taken, where the Russian soldiers were just being fought, right where it all happened on the map. We're dealing with footage from this area up here, so this is the Russians' attempt to get right back into Kupiansk, pushing through those woods over there, using the Oskil corridor and aggressively trying to force their way in. We've marked the Oskil River here. It runs right across town, if you will. And the first attack was pinpointed 100%, right at this exact spot. That means they basically tried to move right along the riverbed, down into the urban area further south, to then attack these. At most, 3 encircled pockets of Russian forces located here. The whole thing, as we saw, it's going very badly for the Russians here, at least in Kharkiv, and usually ends with the reinforcements' deaths. They are sent toward Kupiansk in pairs or threes and have virtually no chance of survival whatsoever. Let's take a look at another video, this time from the Sumy region, so we don't forget that even here, away from the main front, Russian attacks are still going on. Here we see the small village of Ryshivka, and we're going to take a look at what Russia is deploying here. They're mainly fixed-wing kamikaze drones. Here you can see one of them coming in, basically slamming straight into this house, crashing right into it. Interestingly, in Ryshivka, there's no Russian advance. That means we don't have any soldiers in this region of Ukraine. It's actually near Chotkino. Chotkino, for the Russians, is a relatively important town in the Kursk region they wanted to hold on to, and it was attacked on several occasions by Ukrainian units who struck there intermittently over time. Not this year, but last year and the year before. So the Russians have pulled a lot of troops together here and are basically terrorizing the villages, or they're completely emptying the villages on the other side of the border. And of course, Ukrainian soldiers have now taken up positions in the ruins or in the abandoned houses here. So you can also see positions here in places, I think you can see it pretty clearly, positions of the Ukrainian army, those trench systems dug out along here so they don't get a Russian incursion at this spot. We've already got Russian troops in parts of Sumy trying to push in there. This is a few dozen kilometers away from there, but even here, the Ukrainians expect that if the defenses get weak enough, the Russians will come out from Tyotkino and begin pushing forward into the area. Cross over, go to Rishivka or elsewhere, invade here. And so there are Ukrainian positions. But above all, it's these massive Russian attacks with kamikaze drones on the region. That shows us that even in regions where the Russians aren't currently trying to push forward on the ground, advances are being prepared here too, that invasions are being prepared here as well. Also in those places where there's currently no front line inside Ukraine, there are still Russian short-range attacks, not just the Shahed and long-range strikes that are being flown at Ukraine all the time. And those Shahed drones, we just mentioned them, are a huge problem for Ukraine. They're using anywhere from about 100 up to 800 of them per night against the Ukrainian civilian population across the whole country. For weeks now, they've been destroying entire heating systems, for example, which is why many millions of Ukrainians have to hunker down in temperatures of at least minus 20 degrees. Many still flee, of course, and we've got new footage showing how to fight these Shaheds more effectively. Specifically with these Sting drones here, they're small interceptor drones used against the big Shahed drones. This is about 30 to 40 centimeters long, while the Shaheds are about 4.7 meters. Now we can clearly see how they're deployed. That is, of course, by being loaded onto a launch ramp and then being switched to armed now. So we're basically seeing it right here now. It's being armed, the drone's being prepped, and it even has a small explosive warhead on its very front. This unit here is working with the Sting, so they shoot down these Shahed drones to protect the Ukrainian civilians. The whole unit here is all women. Right now we're looking at one of the women who prepared this setup. We can now see the drone taking off, and right here the different operators of the Sting drones, which are being used to defend Ukrainian airspace and the civilian population, standing ready and coordinating their actions and monitoring feeds. Now some of the impacts here, that means we can see Shahed drones being hit again and again by the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground close to the front. It's only women in the unit deployed here. Interestingly, they're basically sitting in a small shed out somewhere in the countryside, not at the front. Could be 100, 200 or 300 kilometers away. The important thing is to try and intercept those Shahed drones before they reach their targets. But we know that many of the targets are also in the western part of the country. So even if, say, one of those Shahed drones flew past Kiev, you still have to take it out. So you can intercept it before it lands in Ternopil or Lutsk or Lviv or anywhere else out in the west of the country. In other words, it's once again crucial to see that it's not just men in the Ukrainian army defending the country, but many women too, protecting the airspace and of course their families and local communities alike against Russian aggression. Let's go back to the battlefield again and take a slightly closer look at another attack with a HIMARS system. These attacks have become really rare in recent times because the Russians have deployed numerous and highly effective countermeasures against GPS-guided missiles. And because, of course, the US is supplying noticeably less ammunition these days, some even say there's no ammo at all anymore. And so we're looking right here at a very rare attack on an R412 radar system. Codename Torf of the Russian military. Now we can see, here you can see it pretty clearly, the big antennas sticking out of a position like a protected or camouflaged emplacement of the R412 on this Ural vehicle or based on an Ural vehicle here. And in just a few moments from now, we'll see the actual impact take place. So here we can see it pretty clearly. A primary explosion from that HIMARS rocket on the right side, then a secondary explosion right next to the vehicle, and then we'll see in a moment what it looks like afterward. There's practically nothing left. Here we can see it pretty clearly, almost nothing left of that Ural truck with its superstructure there, utterly wrecked and burned out entirely. So that was basically a direct hit, which also led to a secondary explosion. And insofar we see HIMARS is still being used, but only very, very rarely. Why? The Ukrainians simply don't have any ammo. The Americans aren't sending any more. Under Joe Biden, there used to be a steady supply of ammo for the HIMARS regularly delivered. Now it's like this. Only when an EU country buys something through the buyers program and then forwards it to Ukraine do you get the occasional single missile. And that only happens sporadically. But the steady flow, and with it the regular use, no longer takes place here. What Ukraine isn't getting from the US but gets from many European countries and even develops are robotic systems that handle logistics. And here there's a really interesting recent video that shows us just how sturdy these robots have become, how they go through unbelievably deep potholes and even potholes filled with water and ice that can move. I'll just let the video run so you can see here without any human help and only with an operator who's probably nearby steering it and guiding it. Makes it here this little Wally, that's what they always call it as a joke, as a nickname, back out of this big pothole. And you can also see here The Ukrainians are reinforcing it pretty much like putting snow chains on a car, so these robots can move and get around over the rough terrain more reliably and steadily. We saw earlier the Russians keep attacking them. It's becoming more and more important what roles these robots have in logistics and in supplying Ukraine's frontline troops. Finally, we're switching once more from the battlefield to the Black Sea, specifically the region around Novorossiysk. There, the Ukrainian army attacked another Russian tanker ship, or at least a tanker operating on Russia's behalf, in the Black Sea near Novorossiysk. We've got footage here from a surveillance camera on the Delta Harmony, which was attacked a few days ago. We see the whole thing. Here a bit later, it already happened on Tuesday at 5:15 in the afternoon. And we're watching it now, and you can maybe make out over on the left side. I hope you can see it a bit more clearly. There's something black coming in right here. We're not entirely certain. Most likely it's not something that's swimming, but rather something that's flying. So it's probably a Ukrainian drone flying toward the ship here, but you can't really make out its exact shape. We can definitely see now that this object is closing in very fast on the tanker up front, and then there's an explosion on the ship. That means not on the hull of the ship, but on the structures installed here. For the petrochemical cargo. So we're seeing it again now. Here's the approach and here are the explosions on the ship. Overall, 4 tankers are said to have been hit, Russian bloggers reported. It's still not clear, though, what the other attacks looked like. What we can see here is that Ukraine has once again managed to successfully strike a sanctioned tanker operated by Russia's Shadow Fleet in a deliberate strike. On the way to Novorossiysk, a lot of oil and gas, mostly from Russia, but also from places like Kazakhstan and other regions, is loaded there and then pumped into the international market. For the Ukrainians, it's important that the sanctions we've imposed on those tankers are actually enforced, physically enforced. So this is a very robust operation by the Ukrainian army. We're looking at the whole thing again on the map and can see how unlikely and how difficult it has become for the Ukrainians to push far. We can see down here a bit of the Turkish coast, and we know that after sailing through the Bosporus, the Russian tankers pretty much have to take a huge detour, so they don't go straight from Istanbul to Novorossiysk any longer. Their sea voyages are now completely different than before. They go down along the Turkish coast, now skirting Georgia, and then try to sail into Novorossiysk in order to keep as far away as feasibly possible from any potential Ukrainian attack attempts. Also from seaborne drones like the Magura and so on. However, as we just saw, in the end, Ukraine has now managed, probably with a drone coming from Odessa, to get in here just before the main sea entrance to the large port of Novorossiysk, to intercept the Russian tanker and thereby damage it as well. So yeah, the Russian companies are trying to reroute their tankers here, but they can't just reroute everything to make a detour for the whole oil and gas infrastructure, logistics and supply chains. The main port is in Novorossiysk, so you keep having to go back there. That means the Ukrainians can, like hunters, wait for the prey and then strike decisively when the opportunity arises, leaving little time to react. Sometimes they pull it off. Ukraine keeps acting with the sanctions. Europe has set up own sanctions, but unlike Ukraine, our sanctions do not pressure the Shadow Fleet as much as these physical attacks.